Well, hello again, and this is the second video in a series about the airline industry and how technology has been used for competitive advantage. I want to start talking about American Airlines, which is kind of the most famous, the canonical story about how to use information technology to compete and how information technology can change an industry. Now, one of the things you need to do if you're going to understand how a company operates is to understand its history. Most companies are actually formed very much by how they were started. And American Airlines is no different. It was started as a company that was formed out from about more than 100 small airlines that joined together with under the name American Airlines. In 1934, under a very charismatic leader named C.R. Smith. And C.R. Smith is together with a guy named Juan Trippe, who formed Pan American, seen as kind of the fathers of modern airlines. Now, C.R. Smith got all these airlines to merge, many small airlines that didn't make much money, and managed to get costs under control. And he did a few very, very important things. One of them was to standardize on one particular plane, an airplane, and that was a McDonnell Douglas DC-3. And it's very important in an airline that you, as much as you can, have the same airplane in many roles, because pilots have to be certified for a particular plane. If all the planes are the same kind, you can move the planes between destinations, you can move pilots between planes. It introduces a lot of flexibility. All your maintenance people know the planes and so on. The DC-3 was an exceptionally important plane because it introduced modern air travel. It actually looks like a modern airplane, even though it was made in the 30s. It is what is called a dominant design, which we'll learn about in a different video. So C.R. Smith standardized the airline on DC-3s and created an airline that spanned the United States and flew between many cities. The airline market at that time was regulated. So you couldn't set your own prices. You had to apply to the government to get a permission to fly a route. And to do that, you had to show that there was traffic and that you could do it for a reasonable cost, what was deemed reasonable. So there was a large bureaucracy that basically looked after the airlines. Now, then gradually the planes got bigger and faster, and in the late 50s, there was a shock in the industry, which was the introduction of a new kind of airplane, the jet airplane. The passenger jet came in the mid to late 50s, and it was the Boeing 707, which became the first really successful model, which was used by many airlines. The introduction of jets created a crisis in the industry. Much like another example, the Bank of America, where a growing population in California created an operational crisis for a big bank. And in order to understand why the jet created a crisis, we have to understand how reservations were done back then. You have to cast your mind back to the 1950s. No computers, you have telephones, and you have propeller planes. And if you look at a map of the United States, I can try to explain how it worked. So here we have a map of the United States. And so imagine that you are going to fly from New York, and New York is about here. That's New York. And you want to fly to LA, which is about here. So LA. Okay. Now, the thing is, with a propeller airplane, you can't fly the whole distance in one jump. You have to fly in smaller jumps. And a typical trip to LA could, for instance, be flying to Chicago, which is here. I'll just write O'Hare because it's Chicago O'Hare Airport. And then some city in between. A typical example could be Denver, which is located about here. So I'll just write D-E-N for Denver. Okay, so you, instead of making one flight, which you do today on a jet airplane, you would make 4 flights. Now, remember, there were no computers. There was no way for the airline to keep track in a central location of all their flights. So what happened was, if you were going to travel, and remember, not many people did it. It was very expensive. It was mostly business people that traveled, government officials. Leisure travel was something that just only rich people did. So what you did was you basically told your secretary that I have to fly to Los Angeles, and she, it would be a she, would then call the travel agent. And but she couldn't call the travel agent and book 4 flights with a single, or actually she would call the travel agent and then say, you know, get a ticket for Mr. Such and Such from New York to Los Angeles. And then the travel agent would start their work. And the travel agents actually had to call not only to each individual airline, they had to first map out using a book, you know, all the scheduled flights and see how could you fly from New York to LA. And then they had to figure out which airlines to call. And then they had to start calling to make reservations. And they would start by calling the city of origin for the first leg. So you call, you know, these trips, they're called legs when you, in airline parlance. So you call the reservation system for American Airlines in New York. And you would ask, you know, I need, let's say, 2 tickets I'm going to fly to LA, but I need to first book a ticket to Chicago. Do you have any available flights to Chicago? And the person at the reservation office would either look it up in a book, so you could have 4 people who were in charge of the New York to Chicago flights, and they would have a shared book. And in that book, there would be a grid, something like this. It would have the flight number, like this, and the date, whatever the date might be. And then there would be a grid like that. And that would be the flights. There weren't that many passengers on each propeller plane. And there would be check marks like this in the book, and there would be a list of the names of the passengers written in. So the agent would get the book, or actually, if it was a big reservation office, there would be a big blackboard on the wall, and they would actually use binoculars to look up and see whether there were available flights, and there would be chalk marks. And then say, okay, yeah, we have seats available on that flight. Do you want me to book them? Yes, okay, so I'm booking 2 flights. What's the name of the passengers? Okay, it's Mr. Such and Such and Mrs. Such and Such. Okay, fine. Yes, I confirm that this is now booked. Okay. And then the travel agent, you know, after having booked the first flight, then had to call the next city and book to Denver. So call Chicago and book to Denver, and the same process would repeat itself. Now, and then she would have to call, or he or she would have to call Denver and book to LA. Now, what happens if the flight from Denver to LA is full? Well, you would have to book a later flight or an earlier flight, and then to backtrack and do the whole thing over again in order to make sure that you had the necessary reservations on the trip. Now, if you look at this, this is a very cumbersome and very labor-intensive way of doing things. But, you know, remember, there weren't that many people flying. The planes weren't that big. The airlines themselves weren't enormous organizations. So there's always a sort of tension between the system that is actually doing the work and the system that is coordinating it. And what we're looking at here is a coordination system that is not very advanced, but the underlying service that's being offered is not that advanced and not that big either. So, you know, it kind of worked. But the airlines were always looking for new ways of managing their reservation systems because there was lots of information that was duplicated in many places. Then, towards the late 50s, there was a shock to the system, and that was the jet engine. And the jet airplane, the jet engine and the jet airplane meant that the planes could get much bigger, they could be much faster, and they could fly much longer. In fact, they could fly twice as fast, twice as long, with twice as many passengers. And here's the problem. Imagine that you have a number of passengers that have booked a flight to Chicago, and some of them are flying on to Denver, and some of them are flying on to LA. Okay. Now, back in those days, there were only full price tickets. There weren't any price competition. So if you pay a full price ticket, if you don't show up, you get your money back. Okay, so maybe 2 people that are supposed to fly this whole trip, they don't show up. Okay, that means that this flight has been canceled. But it also means that this flight and this flight has been canceled, or those seats have been canceled on that flight. And that means that those seats are going to be empty unless you can sell them. Well, you know, if you have about 40 people going on a plane here and they're flying very slowly with a propeller plane here, you get the tickets at the gate when the plane leaves, and you process the tickets, and then you notice, oh, 2 passengers didn't show up. Oh, I better call Chicago and tell them that there are 2 seats available because these people are going to fly on. So they call Chicago, and Chicago notices that, you know, there are 2 available seats. So they mark them as available and they start to sell them. And then they call Denver and say, Denver, we have 2 seats available. The 2 seats that you had reserved are no longer reserved because the passenger didn't show up. Okay. Now, when you got the jet, you know, twice as many people, twice as fast, twice the distance, you could fill up the whole jet and it would take off and it would fly very fast to O'Hare. And sometimes it would land at O'Hare or land at its destination before you had finished processing the tickets at the origin. And that meant that you never got around to telling people on the later flights that the seats were available. And consequently, you got a lot more seats available, or more empty seats on the airplanes. And you know, remember what I said in the first video. We have this notion of a load factor, and what it means is that you need to have a very high percentage of filled seats in an airline in order to make money. And the jet engine created a crisis, and American Airlines had to do something. And for whatever reason, actually it was a stroke of luck. An executive from American Airlines was on a flight, and he was talking to his side passengers, and he was mentioning this trouble they had with keeping track of reservations and how difficult it was and how much money they lost because they weren't able to sell the seats. And the person right next to them was a salesperson from IBM, the computer company. And he said, wait a second, we have some new technology. They had just made a big system called SAGE, and it was for the Strategic Air Command, the big bomb planes that the United States had. And they had introduced a new technology called a modem, which meant that you could send information over telephone lines. And that meant that you could actually centralize the reservation and centralize the processing and the storage of all the information in one single, or a big computer system, centralized. And that's what happened. American Airlines introduced the first reservation system. In the first version of it came in 1957, and it was called SABRE. And the name SABRE doesn't really mean anything. It means a kind of sword, and it was called SABRE, S-A-B-R-E, because they just liked it. They liked it as a name. This was the first computerized reservation system at least in the United States, if not the world. It became, because American Airlines had this centralized reservation system, what they actually did was they, instead of people having to call each originating flight, there would be one big department in New York, and that big department could receive phone calls from travel agents from all over the United States and reserve on all of the flights of American. The system was very simple. All it stored was every available airline seat, and it also stored whether the seat was sold or not, whether it was occupied or not, and the name of the passenger in that seat. And if you start thinking about it, that's a very simple information structure. But if you have that, you're able to make multiple reservations, so you can actually put into the system that, this passenger wants to fly from New York to Los Angeles, and you can make all the intermediate reservations, check that they're available, and just make them. And if the passenger doesn't show up in the beginning, you can put that into the computer system, and immediately the following seats are made available. And because of that system, it has been said that in the first years when the passenger jet was introduced, American Airlines was the only airline that actually made money on jets. So that was the start of the computerized reservation systems. The next chapters in the American Airlines story talks about how this system was then expanded to introduce to take care of the customer interface towards travel agents and later to individual passengers, and to introduce new services and new ways of managing flights. But that's the subject for later videos.